The world as we knew it changed forever that day. The horrifying events that took place on 9/11 in New York City and Washington, D.C., claiming the lives of 2,977 people, will forever be remembered as a turning point in the United States and the world's history. Though the main focus of historians and columnists focus on the build-up to the attacks, as well as the hijacking and crashing of the planes into the World Trade Center and Pentagon on that day, there are a few other things that must be discussed in regards to the aftermath of those tragic events. In this video, we'll be taking a look at 5 things you probably didn't know about 9/11, and hopefully uncover a few facts, figures, and mysteries that require further investigation and explaining. Enjoy. The secret evacuation of Saudi nationals. In the immediate aftermath of the events that shaped the future of international relations, military defenses, and diplomatic sanctions, US airspace was shut down after the attacks on the Twin Towers. Though one would expect this to be standard procedural practice, it would later emerge from multiple reports that certain Saudi nationals, some of which were connected to the royal family, as well as Osama bin Laden's family, were quietly flown out of the US via FBI escort. The evacuation of approximately 140 Saudis immediately after 9/11 has haunted the Bush administration and fueled numerous conspiracy theories in the months and years that followed. The claim goes that the United States Intelligence Agency knew that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and that the country's money was funding the Al-Qaeda network and that of Osama bin Laden. So why did the investigative teams have no authorization or time to interview friends and family members of the one man who became America's most wanted? Oliver Revel, former Associate Deputy Director of the FBI, states that certainly it would be my expectation that they would do that, especially as the US airspace was shut down and no flights were scheduled in or out of the country. However, it would soon emerge that the Saudi Arabian embassy was able to facilitate a secret operation to evacuate them. On September 13th, a covert flight was scheduled from Tampa, Florida to Lexington, Kentucky to move some of the Saudi nationals, including that of the Saudi royal prince, Sultan bin Fahd, followed soon after by at least 8 planes, which stopped over in 12 US cities in order to get them out under the cover of darkness. Shockingly, the flights were authorized and given the go-ahead by White House officials. Former counterterrorism czar for the National Coordinator for Security Infrastructure Protection, Richard Clark, confirmed that he was involved with the discussions and scheduling of such flights from within Washington. It is also reported that approximately 24 passengers were related to Osama bin Laden. As expected, spokespersons for the White House and FBI have denied such reports, stating that they unequivocally had no part in the flights. The Federal Aviation Administration also denied the claims, and yet passenger logs for many of the flights have since been revealed to the contrary, as well as interviews with 2 men, Dan Grossi and Manuel Perez, who were on the planes that took off from Tampa as security guards. One of those on board was the late Prince Ahmed Salman. According to journalist Gerald Posner in his book Why America Slept, Salman had alleged ties to Al-Qaeda as well as foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks. Before any charges could be brought against him, Salman died of a heart attack in 2022 at the age of 43. Reports state that the Bush family had a close relationship with the House of Saud, leading to more than $1.4 billion in investments and contracts over the last 20 years from Saudis to companies in which the Bushes and their allies have had high-ranking positions, including Harken Energy, Halliburton, and the Carlyle Group. Is this a coincidence? What do you think? 9/11 first responders are still dying. As witnessed on our television screens and subsequent newspapers and websites, an enormous plume of smoke and dust swept across Lower Manhattan, over the East River, and into Brooklyn during the attacks. The salvage operation would prove to be just as problematic as the hunt for those responsible, as rescue teams tackled the colossal mass of twisted metal, concrete, and debris, as well as the smog and dust that emitted from the towers. It was reported that the dust and soot was measured at 4 inches thick on surfaces where it settled. Though rainfall assisted in the washing away of outdoor dust in the days and weeks that followed, the fallout of health issues would remain to this very day. At the time, the Environmental Protection Agency and the New York Mayor, Rudy Giuliani, reassured those who were present during the attacks, as well as native New Yorkers, that despite the concerns and visible destruction, the air quality was safe to breathe. However, it wouldn't take long for the people of New York and honest health authorities to squash these claims, and that the dust thrown out by the collapse of the Twin Towers contained asbestos, heavy metals, lead and toxic chemicals, such as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Research teams also identified volumes of gypsum and calcite, minerals commonly used in building materials, including cement and plasterboard, which are known to irritate the eyes and lungs. As of 2024, there are approximately 127,567 people enrolled in the World Trade Center Health Program, according to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. As of December 2023, 6,781 of those who were registered with the program have died from an illness or cancer linked to their time near or at Ground Zero after 9/11. Shockingly, this number is more than twice the number of people who actually died on September 11th, 2001. In September 2024, the FDNY announced more than 360 firefighters, EMT, and department personnel have passed away from World Trade Center related illnesses. More than 343 people had lost on the day itself. Those brave yet unfortunate souls who were exposed to the dust and smoke on that fateful day contracted various types of cancers, autoimmune diseases, asthma, respiratory illnesses, and lingering post-traumatic stress disorder. Rare diseases such as sarcoidosis, lumps formed by inflammatory cells, have also been discovered to occur at abnormally high rates in firefighters who are exposed to the elements. Congress member Dan Goldman is among a coalition of elected officials pushing legislation that would make funding for the World Trade Center Health Program permanent. Congress had to pass a $676 million stopgap measure to make up for the shortfall last year. This bill would mean that we would not have to keep doing this every year or every couple years, Goldman said. There's going to be a shortfall again predicted in 2028, and the reason we're pushing for this bill is that this is our duty as Americans. Of the 2,753 people killed at the World Trade Center buildings, 1,103 remain formally unidentified. There has not been a new identification of 9/11 remains since January of 2024. Expensive artwork was lost. It must be said that the loss of life, subsequent health issues, and resulting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are the main talking points of September 11th. However, there was also another great loss that occurred during that day. Though it is not as sacred as the lives of those who perished, the World Trade Center housed extremely rare, expensive works of art by the likes of Pablo Picasso, Joan Miró, Alexander Calder, amongst other great artists and designers. All known works of art were completely destroyed in the attacks, which to the artists' families, fans and communities was another shock and depressing event. It is reported that numerous artworks in the private collections of businesses and agencies that had offices in the World Trade Center, as well as several pieces of public art commissioned by the Port Authority over the years, were displayed throughout the complex. These works included the World Trade Center Stable, a red steel sculpture by the late US native Alexander Calder, also known as the Bent Propeller, that was displayed within the courtyard of the center. Spanish artist Joan Miró had a large tapestry that hung in the lobby of No. 2 World Trade Center, and paintings by Picasso, David Hockney, and Roy Lichtenstein, as well as works by Paul Klee and Le Corbusier, were displayed in the Marriott Hotel's collection. French sculptor Auguste Rodin's drawings and sculpted designs were also destroyed, which were owned by the Cantor Fitzgerald brokerage firm, who lost 650 employees in the disaster, and whose late founder was a renowned rodin collector. Certain parts of a Calder sculpture were recovered, but not enough to fully restore the work. One of the craftsman's famous works, called The Thinker, was seemingly found in the days following 9/11, but mysteriously disappeared a short time later. Many believe that it was stolen from Ground Zero. In all, approximately $100 million from private collections and $10 million in public art was known to have been destroyed. The World Trade Center alone held more than 430 tenants at the time of the attacks, Additionally, the decorative art that each office contained, some firms held large corporate art collections, therefore the figure would most likely have been much higher in value. 3 companies held major corporate art collections in the World Trade Center: Fred Alger, Cantor Fitzgerald, and Bank of America. In October 2001, a spokesperson for insurance specialist AXA Art described the attacks as the biggest single disaster ever to affect the art industry. Only one civilian plane was allowed to fly the day of 9/11. Here's an interesting and lesser-known fact about 9/11. After the immediate suspension of flights and complete shutdown of US airspace, it is noted that a single Learjet 36 was permitted to fly, despite the turmoil and devastation that was occurring on the grounds below. The reason for the authorized flight was the fact that it was carrying a life-saving snake antivenom from San Diego to Miami for someone who had been bitten by a deadly taipan. The flight was escorted by 2 fighter jets. The physical flight took off on September 12th, and it was eventually concluded that at least 3 other flights occurred that day, one of which being the return transit of the anti-venom aircraft, as well as a flight which was believed to have been a military helicopter, possibly transferring the bitten man. Lawrence Van Sertima was a snake handler in Florida who suffered the bite from the serpent, and thus required the rare anti-venom medication that was only available within certain parts of Florida and California at the time. Despite what was going on, the flight from San Diego to Miami was allowed by the Federal Aviation Administration, which ultimately saved Van's life. However, official reports from the FAA state that airports and commercial flights reopened on September 13th. This included all civilian flights except for scheduled passenger flights, which would take longer to resume. Christopher Fries, an aviation historian, pilot, and flight instructor who worked under the FAA Flight Service Station to provide pilots with flight plans and weather reports, was part of, alongside AOPA writer Julie Walker, an article for the Associated Press which ran on September 14, 2001. In it, the article, a man identified as Captain Al Cruz, a paramedic with Miami-Dade Fire Rescue's Venom 1, was said to have treated Van Sertima. Cruz stated that he recalled sitting by Van's bedside for 30 hours while he recovered. He went on to state that after more than 6 hours of discussions, permission was finally granted at 3 a.m. for the transportation of the antivenom. The flight, piloted by John Rappis, left San Diego at 9 a.m., traveling across the country to arrive in Florida and save Van with an additional 5 vials. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force notes that another civilian flight took off on September 12, 2001, a Cessna 172 Skyhawk that conducted aerial surveys of the damage. The museum wrote, following the Al-Qaeda terrorist attack in the United States on September 11th, this Skyhawk, tail number N9344L, was the only civilian aircraft authorized to fly in and around New York City on September 12th. Elevator tragedies were the deadliest in history. Witnessing the events unfold from the grounds below or from our television screens was a harrowing experience for millions. Watching the planes hit the towers, people jumping out of the windows towards certain deaths, and eventually the towers collapsing was terrifying. And yet another tragic event was occurring within the walls of those infamous buildings that many do not realize or tend to overlook: those who perished in the elevators. The World Trade Center had one of the world's most complex elevator systems. It boasted 198 of the biggest, fastest elevators ever built. However, these high-functioning compartments became a mixture of life-saving mechanics and a deadly contraption for those who took the risk to use them on that fateful morning. It is estimated that at least 200 people died inside World Trade Center elevators, making it the biggest elevator catastrophe in history. No one can truly understand, feel, or know what was going through the minds of those who managed to escape the buildings through the elevator system, or shafts, or to those who realized that their time had run out and there was no escaping such contraptions. One can remember the images of the terrified victims who plunged to their deaths from the rooftops and windows, yet there were others who either leapt or fell when the elevator cables were destroyed after the planes collided with the building's infrastructure. It is reported that certain people burned to death as the flames shot down the shafts, as well as those who died after the elevators hit the ground at high speed. On one hand, USA Today produced a report where it identified 21 people who were trapped behind locked elevator doors and managed to fight their way out. Approximately 80 other people within the elevators survived because the doors happened to be open just as the jet hit, or opened automatically without the assistance of passengers. On the other hand, the investigative report could not find an instance in which emergency responders managed to successfully rescue victims from the elevator systems, although some firefighters were known to have died in their brave attempts. As the reports continued to arise, it was pointed out that, amongst the carnage and chaos, poor communications between the rescue units meant that the elevators were not considered a high priority, despite passengers using the intercoms to report their locations. Criticism among certain response teams was followed up by an extensive assessment of the safety devices which were designed and installed to prevent people from falling down shafts, but evidently locked them inside the elevators the moment they malfunctioned. And when the second jet hit the South Tower at 9:03 am, 16.5 minutes after the attack on the North Tower, the World Trade Center's elevator mechanics decided to leave the buildings, though not in cowardice, as they planned to return later to help firefighters. No one expected what would happen next as the buildings crumbled to the ground. Further assessments showed how the elevator shafts worked as chimneys, which funneled smoke to the floors above where the planes hit. The shafts also emitted burning jet fuel through both towers. The fires also channeled from side to side, causing major explosions within elevator lobbies and in the adjoining restrooms. Films such as 911 starring Charlie Sheen and Louis Guzman, and World Trade Center starring Nicolas Cage portray the disaster from inside the walls and elevators, ensuring that we remember everyone who suffered that day. And so, this brings us to the end of today's video. The event that occurred on September 11th, 2001 cannot and will not be forgotten. Much like the stories to emerge from World War II, there are so many tales of those who witnessed, survived, and/or unfortunately perished during the attacks and in the events that followed. 9/11 changed the way we live our lives, how security is handled at airports, and rendered the world a more unstable and unsafe place to live. We must ensure that the memory of those who died that day, and the days and months that followed, is not in vain, and continue to strive to remake the world a better place, where evil in all of its forms will never reign victorious.